Okay. So just to show that the potash effect, when I looked at lacrosse, we'd already seen this here and there. And so what I alluded to back in 2016 at the agronomy farm and at Penny, we had a number of trials that looked at pretty intense management, and one of which was looking at in-furrow fertilizer trials. So one of the treatments we had actually had a pretty high rate of phosphorus and potassium applied over the top. And so the thought process again was just to not be limited, go for 100 bushel beans. So a lot of people, when I came here 10 years ago or so, like potassium's the way to go. So again, just soybeans need them in a large way, but the chloride that's coming out of that potash, double at 60, I think is really hitting us. And so here's an example. This is one where we had no yield effect. So 66 bushel beans untreated control, that phosphorus and potassium combination, 66 bushel beans. Now we go to West Lafayette. We had 62.5 bushel beans untreated control, and we dropped 4 bushels with that application that was applied after planting over the top. I want to make a note that we were taking notes on development, growth, different growth stages, injury because it was an in-furrow trial, in-furrow fertilizer trial. So nothing was noted that we could see above ground in the way they're developing. So I think it is all underground. I think it's root related. And again, as I alluded to, I thought it was more related to root and nodules. In 2017, I kind of just singled it out to potash. So it's still a high rate, 120 pounds of K2O. It's really not a high rate whenever you think about what we apply across our fields, but in context of that sulfur interaction that I showed you in the video, I mean, this is twice as much and applied over the top. So again, in agronomy farm, West Lafayette and Wanata, these were able to be combined. And so once again, we go from 59 bushel beans down to 55. We get a 4 bushel yield hit with this application. So back in 2016, thought it was maybe a fluke. 2017, thought it was a little higher rates. And then as I showed you guys to the 2019 lacrosse study of the sulfur by NPK interactions, it's not a fluke. It does occur with soybeans. And when you think about applying this potash over the top. So I'm going to skip past this because you've already seen this part of it because it's another talk. And I use similar slides. So here's my thoughts on potash at planting. We were anywhere from 60 to 120 pounds of K2O near planting, and fairly common to get a 3 to 5 bushel yield hit from that. I'll also note that I've had some colleagues up in Minnesota that have been getting some yield hits on their soybeans with spring applications. I've only looked at over the top at planting, and so that's all I can speak to. Jim Cambrato and I are kind of putting together a little bit of a write-up on this so people can at least be aware of it. If you have coarser texture soils, I know a lot of guys don't like to make a fall application with potash. They'd rather make it every year and make it in the spring, or some cases they do make it up to planting. So it's just some cautions here. We did not have anything affected in terms of plant stand. Above ground, only stunting was later in the season when you compared that with some of the combinations with the sulfur or without it. So that's where that was coming to play. Early development, I didn't see that. But I do go back to, I think we have root damage, so affecting nutrient and water uptake, nodulation and fixation. Did not see any chloride toxicity, again, above ground. If you're down, got any folks that down in the Mid-South, they run irrigation on soybeans. Chloride is an issue on their water and those soybeans, so they actually develop varieties that are chloride occluders or excluders, that they don't take up chloride in the same way, or they partition in the plant so they don't get the toxicity, so it's a major issue. Our varieties that we grow in the Midwest does not have this kind of trait. They're not bred for it, at least I'll put it that way. And so we don't have that as an option if this is kind of your way of handling potash is over the top at planting. So the better route is to look at it in a different route. And so with that, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur seem to alleviate some of that issue, and so improving nitrogen supply directly or indirectly with the nodulation. And there's another thought out there that maybe the sulfate or the nitrate was taken up preferentially over the chloride. So last point on the potash itself, and then see if there's any questions before I share a few more things if you want to hear them, is let's manage the soil K so it is above critical levels ahead of the soybean growing season. If the soil K is low to very low ahead of soybeans, here's my priority list. A fall application of potash is preferred. Again, assuming your soils can handle that. Early spring applications are still going to be beneficial, especially if that soil test K is low. Slight risk of a chloride injury. Again, I say that just based on colleagues up in Minnesota seeing some of their spring applications having some injury. Applications near planting, I think it's very risky. I would not recommend that. I will say if your soil is low and you need to get out there and that's the only time you can get it, the soybeans are probably still going to use that potassium and not get as much of a yield hit because you probably get more of a yield hit from the lack of potassium. But if equipment's available, I'd much rather run from VE, so emerged soybeans, to V2. So again, those roots have already developed, and then the soybeans can bounce back from any of the tire damage that will go across. If it's a maintenance application of potash, go ahead of corn, fall application. If you have to do soybeans, again, it's going to be that same order of fall is preferred over early spring, and then in season. I would not be making any of these applications, even though that a couple times we have had no negative effects with an app planting. I've seen enough to cause a concern that I really don't want to sell ourselves short in that way. So that's the potassium side, potash story. And it really is potash, the double out 60. I dare say if we were to look at another source of potassium, so potassium sulfate or K-mag, or maybe even white potash where they've taken out more of the chloride, I don't think we're going to be seeing that. And so that may be another avenue for us to look at. But right now, if you're looking at double out 60 or red potash with the chloride that's in there, I would not be recommending any application over the top. Any questions on that potash side of things before I share maybe a few slides on other interactions that we're seeing on the sulfur? I'm not seeing
Shaun,
any.
this is, oh, I have a question for you, Shaun. You said something about maybe allowing time for that chloride to leach out of the system. Do you know how much water is needed or how much rain, or have you guys looked at that much yet to see if there's a 1 inch, 2 inch of water? Or?
Right. I have not looked at that. I think a lot of that will come down to how much are you applying for one, for two, what soils are you running this on? So texture, permeability, hydraulic conductivity is what we're talking about. How fast is it percolating through the soil? I think a lot of those come into play. So I don't have a good sense. I haven't looked up, haven't talked to some of the soil physics side of that, as well as the chemistry on the fertilizer itself. So I don't know. So that's probably something for Jim and I to follow up on.
Thanks.
Shaun, I had a question.
Sure.
So how does no-till versus conventional till make a difference with that injury on potassium?
So the thought process of in a conventional till, are you going down the route that you would apply it and work it in? Is that your question versus no-till where it'd be applied on top of the soil surface?
Yes, and mostly I'm no-till, so I would apply it right before planting and then plant into what I normally put on 100 pounds of phosphate DAP and 200 pounds of potash is normally what we've been doing.
Yeah, and so you're applying that right ahead of planting a no-till. So when I've looked at I'll go back to the video, had the sulfur by NPK. Those were no-till conditions and were applied right after plantings within a few days. And so you saw 1 year in 2019 where we got a 5 bushel yield hit. 2020, we didn't in that particular year. Again, I haven't gone back to look at the rainfall patterns, but I mean, those were no-till. It's a coarse texture. I call it a loamy sand, sandy loam, 2.5% organic matter, but it's still kind of that coarse texture. What kind of soil texture are you?
I would be more clay loam with less, right around 2% organic, 1.9.
Yeah. With the no-till, I think that we're still getting into this side of how much is it going to percolate, and then if it's clay, it's a little heavier I mean, how long you been no-tilling? I'm just kind of curious so that I can think through.
Minimum tilling for, let's say, 8 or 9 years. No tilling for 2 years.
Okay. So still relatively young in that way, but I mean, minimum until 8 years, so you should still have enough, porosity, kind of building up to get some good flow. I think that would actually work out better in one sense versus a tilled situation and incorporating. We haven't done that version of incorporating and getting it down and leach down further. So I think you're going to have a concentrated band is probably what you're going to have with the no-till. And so depth of the soybean seed being planted comes into mind. And then again, if you're saying you're doing within a week or two ahead of planting, I think you're probably creating a zone that's going to have a fairly high chloride content. And so beans are going to work through it. I don't feel like we're going to get anything tied up in the residue itself. So to think about that being a benefit, I just don't see that. Again, I go back to our 2019 trial where we got a 5 bushel yield hit on that. So I don't see in the scenario that you painted a no-till ahead of planting a week or two. I think they're still just as apt to get that chloride injury versus, let's say, your same soils and you'd worked it in. There might be a potential to have a little bit of, I'll put it in dilution of the fertilizer into the soil profile and then Mother Nature work it through. But I think regardless of no-till, conventional till, if you're within a couple weeks of planting, I still think they're both going to be pretty high risk. When you said, what did you say, 200-pound rates of potash?
Yes.
So yeah, you're 160 or 120 pounds of K2O. So that higher end where I was continuing to see yield hits.
So it's probably best just to save that potash for fall application for the
I would,
just leave it.
I would, unless you have soils that are testing low, all right, so are testing low and they need it. I mean, I would go ahead and do it. I would be more apt, I'm not sure what's your equipment. I would rather wait till the soybeans are up, VE to V2, and make that application on standing soybeans than 2 weeks prior. If we're talking, okay, we're just getting to February, if you're within the following month or so, February to March, I think we'll be okay. Again, I don't have the data with our soils. I will make the comment that up in Minnesota, even those applications are causing some injury to their soybeans. So if you're able to wait until a fall application ahead of corn, that's my ideal. And then again, provided that your soil test levels are going to maintain where they need to be for the soybean season. So that's my ideal. If you need a maintenance for this year's soybeans, wait until they're up or get it done within the next month, basically.
Thank you.
Yep. Foliar K applications in response to the question in a private chat. I haven't done as much on that. I've had a few off treatments here and there on that. In terms of getting to the same level of what you need in a total removal, we're never going to get to that point. Now, if we're talking about using that to help get through, I think even soils that are above critical levels for potassium, we are going to have situations where we start to dry out during seed fill. Come August, September, you're going to start to see the leaf margins yellowing up, get chlorotic. We're going to have on the upper portion of the plant, which is opposite of a typical potassium deficiency. That's going to start showing up. Whereas some of those foliar K applications during that period, so a drier period, can actually have some benefit in that situation. If we're looking at foliar K to just be our K source, that's different. So I'm not sure if that's answering all of your question there in the chat, but those are a couple comments that come to my mind right now on foliar K. All right. I'm willing to answer anything else. I did want to share, I had another talk. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I wanted to share at least a couple slides because it's down that southwest part of the state. I tried to run the whole state, but I don't always get it all together here. So let me share maybe just 2 slides. I got to switch out to PowerPoint. Give me a second. State, switch. Okay. Here we go. Back to Zoom, share screen. You get the play-by-play here. Sorry about that. There we go. That's the one I want. So this is just on timing on the sulfur. This is down at Vincennes. So last year in 2020, the comment's been made. You know, I continue to say if we're going to do sulfur and to see if we have responses, to apply it as close to planting as possible. So within a couple weeks of planting, ideally, I'd rather have it at planting or thereafter. And here's a couple points on the thereafter that I've looked at Vincennes, and I've got some other ones, but again, getting a little closer to your neck of the woods than just my up in the Northwest or West Central or East Central for that matter. So in 2020 at Vincennes, we did large scale, had 20 pounds of sulfur applied using AMS, so again, ammonium sulfate, applied pre-emergence or close to V5, so those are 2 treatments there. I also had a nitrogen component, trying to tease out, you know, if there's just a fertilizer nitrogen effect as, you know, 20 pounds of sulfur. Let me get the laser on, sorry. The 20 pounds of sulfur from ammonium sulfate gives us 17.5 pounds of nitrogen. So I get asked all the time, Shaun, is that sulfur response from AMS just sulfur or is it fertilizer nitrogen? So that's what we're trying to address with a few of these other trials. So we put out another nitrogen source, just nitrogen. We had UAN pre, and then during the season, I used urea at V5. So same timings of pre-emergence versus V5 with a sulfur AMS source or just nitrogen alone. We didn't have an interaction. And so in other words, you know, it didn't matter if it was at pre or V5. We either saw a response or didn't see the response. And here's the response we saw. We had the benefit of AMS. So untreated was just shy of 49 bushels in the trial last year. The nitrogen alone, so this is going to be pooled across, you know, UAN pre or urea at V5 was just at 50 bushels, so no different than the untreated control. And then the AMS in this case was a yield of what, about 6 bushels, 5-6 bushels with that. In 2016, when I was just starting to get ramped up, I call it my shotgun study. So in 2016, I had a partial shotgun study down at Vincennes as well. So just kind of piecing some of these together. And one of those treatments within that, I had AMS, and we weren't able to apply it until V3 had a +5 bushel response. And so what this is really telling me in that trial, those trials, as well as some other ones, is that we have a little bit of flexibility of when we put out this soluble source like ammonium sulfate. As long as it's pre-emergence to early vegetative stages, I think we get the vast majority of that benefit. There's going to be other people and even researchers across the state lines that say, oh, we need to apply it later. I've done studies where we've applied it as late as R1, R2 in a broadcast at these higher rates, and we don't get the benefit out of it. And so if you're going to play the sulfur game, it needs to be earlier in the season. And again, it would be the growing seasons where I'd look to it, not, you know, the March application. Sulfur moves through the soil. I'm not a fan of a March application. I think we're going to lose out on that potential. Be much closer to to planting, to pre-emergence, to early vegetative stages to get that benefit. And again, I want to make sure I at least share this in the few moments I've had, just to get a Southwest kind of flavor, even though I know those soils aren't going to be the clay soils that you were talking about, the no-till question a few moments ago. So I'm going to escape out of there. I've got plenty more, but I'm not going to dive into that for right now and just see if there's other questions that come to your guys' minds.
Shaun?
Yes.
I just want to know if you had any experience with using the ammonium thiosulfate as a carrier for the pre-emergence chemistry.
So all of that, I mean, that was my hope, was that would be a great way to get the sulfur out there and get a little extra burn. I've talked to the weed boys on that a number of times over the years. Initially, there was some positive feedback, and then now in the last couple of years, they've looked at it a little bit more, and I think they've done some pretty nice, even greenhouse studies to demonstrate this, that there can be some antagonism with that burn down application. So right now, that's not a recommendation out of the gate to have ATS with some of these burn downs, unfortunately. Other questions?
Hey, Shaun. So on that ATS burn down option, we have ran that with gramoxone. That is kind of an option if gramoxone's in your program. So that's one option. When we're talking like high yield soybeans up to 90 plus bushel and stuff, what do we need to be doing as far as nitrogen? And have you seen that?
Sure. Yeah. So
have you seen that beneficial?
Yeah. So okay. I'll repeat to make sure I catch it. So question is, high yielding soybeans, are we getting sold short eventually with a nitrogen supply, essentially is what you're saying, or do we need to do some more supplemental nitrogen to increase the yield? So is that a more or less yes answer? That's the question. As I'll listen to that, I'll pull up a slide here. Okay, so that's often a question with high yielding soybeans is, is there enough that's going to be supplied? And usually we have a pretty good supply that's from the soil. I've put out 500 pounds of nitrogen in some cases, and to see if we get any more benefit out of that. And here I'm bringing up another nitrogen sulfur study, and it seems like that's all I do anymore. But I think it answers your point, because this other talk that I've started into hidden bits and pieces of is the interactions and the interplay of management. And so in this case, planting date's huge. That's one foundational part of increasing soybean yields. And so in this particular study, we're looking at 10 different, let me get the laser going so you can see what I'm actually pointing at. 10 different nitrogen sulfur treatments across 2 different planting dates. And so in 2018, I think that's my screen's getting covered up a little bit here, but in 2018, that's as early as we could get out up at West Lafayette versus June 5th. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but let's just concentrate on maybe these upfront ones. So we had 20 pounds of sulfur with AMS, should recognize that reference strip that I've used. ATS, so again, question was just asked, and that's actually, again, sprayed right here, but that's just ATS alone. All right, and then now your point of nitrogen, high-yielding soybeans. So I've cut the rate down a little bit in terms of sulfur. We put out 10 pounds of sulfur using AMS, so granular AMS, and then we brought the rest of it with urea. And so if you think about 10 pounds of sulfur from granular AMS, we're getting about 9 pounds of nitrogen from that AMS. So we add in 31 pounds of nitrogen from urea, apply it pre-emergence. That same 40 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of sulfur. We also looked at V4 and then a whole slew of other ones. But let's just concentrate on these upper 3 to 4 of these guys and high yielding beans and interactions. So in this particular set, we have a nice response. This is up on the prairie soil, planted early, not anticipating having any need or benefit of having nitrogen or sulfur on that 3.5–4% organic matter soil. It should have more than enough. But once we start planting earlier, which I want to do, and May 11th isn't even really all that early, but as early as we could in that year, we have some limitations in mineralization and what's coming from the soil. So what's coming from organic matter and nitrogen as well as sulfur. So in this case, we go from 62 bushel beans to gain 7 bushels with that AMS. We gain upwards of 9 to even 15 bushels when we added a little bit of sulfur and a little bit of nitrogen to the system. Now the question would be, all right, is it just the sulfur, or is that nitrogen really helping us out? And I want to again advance a little bit here. The second planting date had no nitrogen sulfur benefit. So thinking about high yielding soybeans, we're going to be planting those suckers earlier. Do we need some nitrogen? A lot of people think that we need to put out nitrogen later in the season for high yielding soybeans, especially if we have irrigation. I've done some of those. I am more of a fan and our data supporting this, is to set the stage early. And so setting the stage early is in the root development, nodule development, and fixation. And so I think we gain a lot from that sulfur in these cooler wet soils because we don't have the sulfur supply from the organic matter yet. We're helping to stimulate nodulation. That's going to help us finish filling out seeds later, help us retain pods. I think that's huge. And we're talking lower rates of nitrogen, not high rates. I mean, 40 pounds, that's not a super high rate. I think when we get a little bit of the benefit there, that's more of maybe, I'll call it as a pseudo starter effect. So this is was in 2018. And let me escape out, or I'll probably advance quickly is what I'll do, because I don't want. So in 2020, we have the same treatments. Let's get that laser back. And so the 40 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of sulfur, I wanted to try to tease out, okay, is it a nitrogen effect or a sulfur effect? So you'll notice that I added in gypsum, pelletized gypsum, a sulfur 4 product, 10 pounds of sulfur applied pre, and then we did 20 pounds of sulfur applied pre using the pelletized gypsum. So in other words, if we get just as high yielding soybeans overall with that gypsum versus AMS, okay, it should kind of tell us the story that the vast majority of that benefit is coming from sulfur. And then, the cascading effect of nodulation, fixation. Sulfur also helps with some micronutrient availability and uptake. Or is it, let's say that we don't have super high yields with 10 or 20 pounds of sulfur from gypsum. And so that additional nitrogen that comes from AMS, or in this case, we even added some urea, is playing it out. So here's some phenomenal responses. Again, this is in 2020, mollisol, prairie soil up at West Lafayette. Earliest planting this year, again, pretty similar, May 12th. You'll notice sizable difference. Untreated control is 62 bushel beans. We go nearly 80 bushels, 18 bushel response with just this standard kind of, do we have a sulfur responsive site or not, recommendation of 20 pounds of sulfur. We have some of the other ones where we have the 40 pounds and 10 pound combination. So now we're running 83 bushel beans. By rights, they're statistically no different, but I mean, I know where a lot of guys are like, okay, we go from 80 bushels to 82 and a half, 83. So we gain a little bit, but I think let's look down here, because again, your question was about nitrogen. Down here, we get 76 bushel beans with gypsum versus 62. So a huge swing again. So 62 bushel beans to 76. We're going to be a 14 bushel response. Not quite as high as those that have a little bit more nitrogen, whether it's AMS or those with a little urea. So I do think we get a little bit of benefit. So in order of maybe 2 to 4 bushel extra with some of this nitrogen that's applied either from the urea or comes with the ammonium sulfate. But the vast majority of what I've been seeing is actually setting the stage for sulfur benefit that's now hitting our nodulation and fixation and a few other things. So I think it is a nitrogen play, but it's more of a nitrogen play through using the factory that you got set up with bacteria and bradyrhizobium and fixation. Long-winded answer, but it's exciting stuff to see these interactions. And then once again, the later planting has no effect from any of these nitrogen sulfur treatments. So hopefully that answered the question, maybe well more than you wanted, but other questions?